Awesome. Hello, everybody. Welcome to It's Our Time podcast. My name is Dalal Jum'a, and this podcast is dedicated to Black and Indigenous voices and to the conversations that matter to us. Today, I am so excited to have my guest, Dr. Kimberly Douglas. And I just want to throw a little of what you do, Dr. Douglas. Dr. Douglas is a business developer for adults with ADHD. She's the author of The Neurodivergent Entrepreneur with the second edition on its way. Just the title alone gets me excited, like The
Very good.
Neurodivergent Entrepreneur. I've not seen a book like that ever.
Right.
Yeah,
Right.
it's so exciting.
Well, thank you for saying that. I appreciate it. And I'll talk a little bit more about that.
Absolutely, absolutely. And I want to highlight something else that is incredible is the podcast that you co-host, the Data Cast with the Data Witches. You have a dope ass newsletter, the ADHD Biz Plug. And this is just to name a few because when I went into your link tree, I was like blown away. I was like, oh my goodness, all these resources and around such a subject that we don't talk about often. It's not in the forefront of dialogue. Um,
Well, first of all, hello everybody, and I want to say thank you for that acknowledgement. It feels good to be seen. It feels good to be heard, and recognizing and being recognized for bringing together things that people don't normally talk about. So that makes me feel like I am making a difference in creating a new space where we can have new conversations. So thank you so much for that.
Absolutely. And that's exactly what it is, the new conversations that really matter. And there are not many spaces that hold it in a comfortable and curious way. Because if it's a new conversation, I have questions. I don't have questions because I don't even know. So it is so interesting. With that, y'all, I please make sure that you check out all the links that are going to be tied to this episode today,
Mhm.
so that you can venture into what this conversation looks like when you're alone and doing your own research. Incredible resources. Today's episode is going to be on neurodivergence, generational healing, and future success.
Oh,
Um, Yes, that's that is the where I'm at with it because a little backstory is that my family is from Sudan,
hmm,
and yeah, we traveled globally for a little bit, and we landed in the United States about 17 years ago. And I started to delve into generational healing the last 3 years ago.
mm,
And it intensified when I parted ways with my immediate family, and I just didn't realize the layers there from our African lineage and then the life that we've cultivated in the United States as a Black family and all of the differences that come up. But what's been interesting for me in my journey now as a 31-year-old Black woman is that for the first time, I'm realizing I'm unmasking. I
mm,
hadn't realized that I've been masking this whole life.
hmm.
And, words like autism, neurodivergence, ADHD started to come up, not by anything specific, but I'll be doing my laundry or doing tasks during the day. And then it would be like, hey, do you remember that thing that you started? Remember that other thing? And I'm like, okay, this doesn't, there's something deeper here. I don't
Hmm.
know the disconnect. And one day I'm just scrolling on TikTok and I come across your video on chattel slavery.
Mm,
And yes, it was a deep one that I came across.
that one.
It hit chattel slavery and autism, and my mind was blown away because I'm like, if that's a conversation I've never heard, that is the conversation I've never heard.
Mm,
Never put those two things together, and I'm just curious if you can just brief people about what neurodivergence is,
sure.
if they don't have an understanding.
So when you say it's a neurodivergent, it's an umbrella term. It is not any type of clinical term. It's an umbrella term that describes people who have what would be considered atypical functioning in their brain, body, nervous system. So that could include people who have autism, people who have ADHD, people who have complex PTSD, who have learning disabilities or learning disorders. Um, um, it can include a range of things, bipolar disorder. And so it's really interesting that we're talking about the intergenerational trauma today because I had not heard of the term neurodivergent. That's something that came to me like in the past few years, but I have a teenage son, and when he started pre-K, it became clear to me that I would have to be a certain type of advocate for him. And as it turns out, he is diagnosed, and so in being his advocate, I started to see how difficult society makes it for parents to take care of the children who have certain needs. And I knew that I would be doing some work like this in some form or another, but I wasn't sure how. So I've been clear that he has certain neurodivergencies, and we have adjusted our lives around taking care of his needs. And it was only in the past few years that I started to think of myself as a neurodivergent person. And so, and in the process of that, also thinking about how my mother might be neurodivergent. And I hesitate to like say a specific diagnosis for her because I don't know for sure, but I have ideas. And I do see signs of certain neurodivergencies throughout my family. And of course, it would not have been diagnosed then. But then I was also thinking about how, like, when my mother was a child, she had to work, she had to pick cotton. And my aunts and uncles, I have an aunt who has sickle cell anemia, and just thinking about being out in the elements and having to cook and having to pick cotton. Um, and so, one of the things about in the United States is we tend to take a historical view of things. So it's almost like the past did not exist unless it benefits us in some way. And we're very ahistorical when it comes to the way Black people are treated in this country. And so we picked up in the middle of this conversation about autism, pick up in the middle of the conversation on TikTok, as if there nothing came before what's happening right now. So if you're telling me that I have autism and it is a highly heritable, it comes from your parents and your grandparents, then what you're telling me is that at some point somebody who was enslaved was also autistic or also had ADHD and definitely complex PTSD because they were subject to abuse all the time. So when we talk about what autism, one of the reasons I kind of got fed up with the conversation on TikTok for a while, and I do every now I go in cycles with it. There's the people come to TikTok to get personal validation related to autism and ADHD. And they talk about it and they talk about it and they talk themselves into like a circle, a spiral or whatever. And then they hit a wall in the conversation. And I believe the reason why they hit a wall in the conversation is because they don't want to have the real conversation. Mm-hmm. And the real conversation is about anti-Blackness. And so you can talk about autism all day long, but you're going to hit a wall because there are limits on what we can know about autism because Black people are not really part of the research. We're not part of the conversation. So one of my other posts you may have seen is about hyperlexia, and hyperlexia is a condition where a child codes or reads very early or has a strong interest in reading and decoding things at an abnormally young age. Okay, so if I were enslaved back in the 1830s and I were hyperlexic, which is part of the autism profile, it's an autism profile. If I were hyperlexic, so you mean to tell me that I could exist and be, well, none of them were okay, but you mean to tell me that I wouldn't be abused further if I were hyperlexic and I had this strong desire and ability to read very early? So we're not having conversations like that. And so autism didn't just show up on my doorstep. It didn't just show up for my child. It came from somewhere. And then we throw in the whole conversation about epigenetics and how, my mother's DNA, my grandmother's DNA are contained within me, and I experienced the trauma that they experienced generationally. And
Absolutely.
so we're having these conversations about autism, ADHD, bipolar disorder. We're having all these conversations as if they do not exist across space and time.
Yes, absolutely. And that's kind of what hit me about the whole thing. Because when I started my healing, it said, well, what are you trying to heal if you don't know anything about your past?
Mm-hmm.
You know? So you have to go back. So I started to go back internally within myself, like my own family system. And then it started to get larger, the history that I have to look back on. And especially what you mentioned about the past does not exist, that erasure. Does that trickle into how neurodivergence is not a topic that's talked about in the Black community? I notice it in my family system as well, but it's like we graze over it like once every 10 years when one kid was born, and they might be, and then we just leave it behind. We don't
Right.
revisit it. And then this kid is growing up like myself, growing up where my needs are not being met because there's that whole part of me, my identity is like neglected, and it not yes, it was neglected, and at the same time I don't even think they could conceptualize that
Sure.
these
Right.
things can happen within our families and such. So I really appreciate that point. And then the complex PTSD, who is raising us, right?
Right.
Like, other than my mother, whose family was also traumatized,
Mm-hmm.
and their family was also traumatized. And then there's like this weird expectancy for me to grow up to be a functioning, successful adult in the American
Right.
system that is seethed in racism and still is. So
Yeah.
breaking those conversations down is really interesting. So I let me pull my um so how do we start creating this dialogue, normalizing this
Well, let
dialogue?
me let me clarify something. So when I
Yes.
say complex PTSD, what I mean, so when we think of PTSD as something that is the result of a specific event or a specific encounter, complex PTSD is a lot of little things over time, or big, like, but they're all big, but a lot of things over time, I'll say that. And the compounding effect of being exposed to harmful situations over and over again. So that's what we mean. So let me tell you where I started the conversation. So my background is actually in academia, and I was tenured at a university, and my tenure was around information science. So I'm a systems thinker. So when I talk about these different things, I always think in systems. So I actually shifted my research agenda to start to talk about the kinds of resources that families need. So when you talk about somebody having ADHD, you talk about somebody having autism, it is inadequate and incomplete to talk about them as individuals when there is a constellation of people around them who probably have some of the same needs, actually. But you really are talking about a family, a system that is called a family, and even further than that, the community. But let's just stick with the family for now. And so my last peer-reviewed article was about the types of resources that families need that have children with ADHD. And so I started to shift my focus, and like if you're posting on social media, if you're writing blog posts, if you're doing these things, the way you start the conversation is you go find a video on TikTok, and then you invite the person to your podcast. And so you're doing all the things. Like, this is how the conversation starts, and this is how it keeps going. One of my other
Yes.
books is called Decolonizing Neurodivergence.
Ooh.
And it brings out some of the points that you've made, which is that we focus, the premise of the book is that in the United States, when we are born, we get a lot of labels to indicate what kind of worker we are, not who we are as people.
Right.
And saying that somebody There are medical diagnoses for ADHD, autism, bipolar disorder, etc. But there are also political, economic distinctions. A lot of autistic people can't be at work at 8 hours a day. Saying that I'm black puts me in a certain underclass. It Saying that I'm a black male, it increases the likelihood that I'm going to be in prison doing industrial manufacturing or customer service.
Yes.
That's where I will be working. That is my job. That is what they have designated for me.
They push
And
you
so
into it too.
they push you into it, right? And so all of these labels tell you what kind of worker you are or are not going to be. And so what that means is that we are born into a system that looks at us as producers and not as people with needs. And so we think about the individual and what the individual fails or succeeds on their own, which is not true. We don't talk about community much. We think and this has all been done through public policy in cardoning off people into the nuclear family unit. What you are told, what is demonstrated over and over again in the United States is that you can't depend on anybody. So you learn that you cannot depend on your community. What that means is that you have so many people, and you see them on TikTok, that show up never having had their needs validated in any kind of way. And that's why I'm saying like people get into a spiral because they just need that validation over and over and over again. And the reason why you need that validation over and over and over again is because you feel like nobody ever really heard you.
Hmm.
And so that acknowledgement from certain people, it just isn't there. And so you kind of get caught up in the spiral. But in that book, that's what I talk about, um, connecting the individual and outcomes for the individual to the different systems in our society. And your family is your first system that imports the values of those other systems. And
Yes.
so I tend to be a systems thinker, and I like talking, creating infographics and books about how these things come together and being able to have a deeper explanation for this and really pushing people, especially white neurodivergent people, to talk about their anti-blackness. Because as long as we exist in a society where there is a permanent black underclass, that is also very bad for them because the tools of oppression that are used to against us against us to deny us benefits, to deny us opportunities, they're also used against white neurodivergent people. And so, but it's really hard, especially people who look at something like autism and they say, oh, well, it makes me so smart. It makes me what they call Aspie supremacy, which is Asperger's, which is an outdated way of describing autism. And they call it Aspie supremacy. It's like, well, I'm so smart. I'm like Bill Gates. I'm like this. I'm like that. Well, that's still anti-black. And so when you get caught up in that and trying to show how smart you are, but you're not having your needs met, when white neurodivergent people do not ask to have their needs met in a certain way, or they don't recognize how poorly black neurodivergent people are treated in comparison to them, then it doesn't advance the conversation for anybody.
I just, the whole of it is 100%. There's like this web that connects all these small parts together, but that affects the whole system at large. One thing that you mentioned is that anti-blackness. In my spiritual side of things, I hit the same understanding. Like, our white counterparts cannot get into a deeper level of spirituality because there's this block of really witnessing and seeing the totality of history. And that's what's keeping us stagnant and feeling like we can't move forward. And then we go into this dismissal, this like saying this thing doesn't exist anymore, it's not as pressing anymore, it's now diluted, it's now all in your head. It's like, no, this is very active and it's affecting you, and your ignorance of it, your avoidance of it is not beneficial to anybody. And so it's interesting that that's reflected in the neurodivergent world as well, that
Hmm.
saying like, I this conversation is not meant for me, finding superiority in that
Yes.
space still.
Hmm. Hmm.
And it pushes the conversation, as you said, backwards. And one thing I do want to touch on is that validation. I was stuck in that cycle myself as well because number one, I didn't even know, I couldn't ground who I was either. So it's like I need you to tell me if you see this thing so that I can
Right.
affirm that this thing is
Yes.
here.
Yes.
So it's like even with the ADHD, the autism, I'm like getting on there showing it to like so that some people can say yes, that is, I'm validating that that is ADHD, that is, but that it does become a cycle that it
Yes.
keeps going.
Yes.
So for me it's like, then is it beneficial to try to have white counterparts included in this conversation, or do we just kind of start to expand our own community dialogue and have that be what presses outwards to the external circle? Because there's no, you're not giving me room, I need to kind of stretch it out a little bit.
Hmm. So I want to go back to what you were saying about the spiritual world. There's a big overlap in those two worlds. If you probably noticed on TikTok, a
Hmm.
lot of the spirituality people talk about being neurodivergent, and that actually
Yes.
tracks very well. That makes sense. Um, there's this country has to do some shadow work, and it doesn't want to do it. It doesn't want to do it.
That's it right there. Yes.
And in order to do that, you have to acknowledge where you are. So when I talk about decolonizing neurodivergence, I had to clarify in a video, you can't eat, pray, love your way to decolonizing. That shit is it's painful
Yes.
because what you are doing, you are forcing yourself to rip your own identity out from under you. Like, who are you separate from the systems that help create you?
Hmm.
And that is very painful for people to do because, and this is one of the issues I have with therapy and counseling, is because you go into this room and it has lots of benefits, but it also tells you to turn inward even more and feel like all the answers are within you. And to some extent, that's true. But what it doesn't talk about, or what most people don't experience, is how they are connected to these systems, how the system has played a role in getting them in that room in the first place, and then what kind of community they need, because they're told to go heal in private, or
Yes.
heal with one to one, or heal to one to just a few. And so, um, we have to talk about. So I had a person who took my decolonizing neurodivergence course. It's like a short course, a 4 week thing, and she's a white person, and she would say, well, she would tell me some things, and then she's like, but I know I have lots of privilege. And I said, in this space, I don't need for you to say that because I know you have privilege. I don't need for you to qualify your statements with that. What I need for you to do is to focus on your healing, because when you are unhealed and not interested in your own healing as a white person, you are dangerous to me.
Hmm. That's right.
And what I even more specific than that, I said, when you cannot help me if you are bleeding all over me. So if I got to take care of you every time we have a conversation, then we're
Yes.
never going to have a conversation about me.
Hmm.
And so in terms of like recommending what white neurodivergent people do, I think there are conversations that they have to have with each other and holding each other accountable, um, where they talk about healing
Hmm. Exactly.
from needing the validation, and that's understandable that they need the validation. Um, but if you don't deal with your anti-blackness, then it's going to be really difficult to get to that point because this is not self-help. That's not what this is. This is a reckoning with who you are. And if you
Yes.
don't want to do that, then you kind of get stuck in a loop. And you can think that you're healed, putting a band-aid on this, putting a band-aid on that, but your core identity is shaped by a society that told you that you have a certain standing here, that you're owed certain things. If you
Yes.
don't deal with that, because your body knows it's not true, If you don't deal with that, then that's always going to be a problem for you.
Yes, and then that band-aid that you think, that loop, it just keeps presenting itself over and over and over, and the
It does.
frustration keeps getting there, the exhaustion keeps showing up, and that dead end happens. You either get calloused, or you lose complete sense of who you are. You just succumb to
Right.
what this thing is
And
manipulating.
at a certain age, you got to make a decision. So I think you did mention publicly your age, and like you were talking about not with the process of working through needing validation, and actually the age that you share with me makes sense because your prefrontal cortex locks in place like around 25, 26, and in the late 20s, you start to think about what your identity is separate from your family. So all of these things make sense. And so I think around as you are approaching 30 is a really good time to evaluate these things. And actually, I think a lot of people, I remember taking this psychology of gender class and we talked about this. I think a lot of people do this, especially women, do this naturally around that age. Really start to think about what your core identity is. And so I think there's some really powerful conversations that can be had at that age about what this these different neurodivergencies have meant in your life and who do you want to but not just the neurodivergency because the neurodivergency is also socially constructed. It's not just the thing that I have that I'm diagnosed with, this particular neurodivergency, but it's also what society says it is and what society needs for it to be. And so it really is the conversation about what's the difference between me and what the system would have me be.
Yes. Like the freedom of, like, for me, when I started to realize that I have neurodivergence or I'm on the spectrum in some way, what came to me is how do I take this within my own identity and define it for within my own person, so that
Mhm.
as I'm navigating life, I I'm aware of my totality, like who I am and what how my mind works, but I'm also not embedding that identity from the definition provided to me by society,
Right.
because
Right.
it's a box.
So, and the thing is, so it's a double-edged sword because on the one hand, you want people to see it. What you really want them to see is the needs you have. And then on the other hand, you don't want it to be a thing. The real question, we can go too far in making it about the neurodivergency. What we're really talking about, and this is what I'm actually writing about now in my next book on decolonizing neurodivergence, what we're really talking about is how do I get my needs met?
Yes.
And so, if we're not, and going back to what I was just saying about white people who identify as who are white and who have ADHD, autism, things like that, if you contribute to a system where a whole group of people cannot have their needs met, you will be harmed by that system. If you
Yeah.
prop this and and so people's like, well, I didn't create it, I didn't start it. If you prop up a system with your silence where a whole group of people are harmed by it and you don't want to hear that they're being harmed by it, those tools now exist to harm you.
Yes, exactly. And that's, I think, where that complacency has been on the forefront of my mind, because
Mm-hmm.
I'm thinking about neurodivergence and then I'm thinking about my experience in the workforce and trying to fit into that mentality. And then I think about the pivot that I made and say, I'm not going to fit into that. So let me start my own entrepreneurial, desires,
Mm-hmm.
and to find my success in that avenue. And I wrote something about the things we have to navigate in the workforce as neurodivergent, as a person of color, and then the complacency that
Mm-hmm.
is so loud, and then people thinking that those structures benefit them, and then they see you being kicked out of those structures, and then
Mm-hmm.
now that structure is elevated because it seems in their mind that it's an exclusive thing that
Yes.
only they have access to. And it can be so frustrating to have those conversations and those dialogues with the white counterpart because of, as you mentioned, if you're bleeding all over me, first of all, be a sensation. I don't like that.
Right.
But more deeply than that is just I lose tolerance for it, and
Mhm.
um, it becomes like I just lose tolerance for it. I don't want to deal with it. I don't know what would be the benefit of it, and that's
Mhm.
why there's that need for doing this healing work on an individual level, and the
Mhm.
fear that white individuals don't have community. They don't have the idea that,
Right.
you can have this deep thing that you're working in yourself, unearthing all of these things, because it's not easy, but you have people around you. I don't think they have the connection to that, to believe that they can have a safety net
Mhm.
that can actually
Mhm.
hold the fullness of that transformation.
Right. I think we have a greater opportunity for community. We don't necessarily have it either because it has been deliberately disrupted. So, but the tenets of white supremacy demand that you do things as an individual.
Yes.
And so that's one of the ways that you can enter the conversation is by talking about Tima Okun, I hope I'm pronouncing her name correctly, 15 Tenets of White Supremacy, and using that as a framework for talking about the performance of, I do a lot of work with Desiree B. Stevens, and she talks about the performance of performing whiteness. And so if you are performing that, then you are being harmful to your neurodivergent self because that performance it mandates that you deny your needs.
I'm so sorry. I just had my little dogs marching out of the room doing their thing over there. Um, but do you mind repeating the last bit
Sure.
that you
No, I
mentioned
was
there?
saying that you have to look at those 15 tenets of white supremacy and really think about those as a neurodivergent white person. So the Tima Okun, Okun, hopefully I'm pronouncing that correctly, wrote years ago about the 15 tenets of white supremacy, and what they demand is that they demand that you behave as an individual. This creed that we are individuals. I think that Black people have a greater opportunity to form community, but our community has been disrupted as well. And so it's not automatic. So, because we do a lot of toxic, harmful things inside, it's
Yeah.
calling it community. But if you are a neurodivergent white person and you are trying to do this work, it or you're not doing the work and you are doing the Aspie supremacy thing. White supremacy demands that you ignore and neglect your own needs. It is requiring that of you in order for you to be a part of it.
Yeah, that abandoning of your needs. And then the other thing that I've noticed about neurodivergent individuals of color being pushed into spaces, and like you've mentioned earlier, like streamlined into these occupations or these um, roles in society,
Hmm.
positioning them like that, their neurodivergence also has that ability to like mimic, imprint, um, you know, it's almost like sometimes it feels like those individuals, those white counterparts that are not making the rules, but are, thinking that they're above, closer to the ones making the rules, then there's this um, bullying, like low
Yeah.
key, high key bullying that
So,
goes on. Yeah.
so they are upholding the system. They are critical to upholding the system
Mhm.
because slavery never ended.
Exactly.
And they're, they believe they still own people.
Yes. Yeah. Yeah.
And white people were deputized in this country to arrest us,
Hmm. Oh
to
wow.
tell on us like that's the Karen behavior. with calling the police because you know that the person could get killed. And so um, they are still deputized.
Yes. And it's the
And
disconnection.
you see it at work, you see it on the street, um, that there's one set of rules and then there's another set of rules. And so they are a critical part because there's always dangled in front of them the promise that they could rise up, they could be more, they could do more, um, and or no matter how far down the ladder they are, they're not us,
Yes.
and they can take satisfaction in that.
The not us is the biggest
Yeah,
thing. You know,
right,
it's, I can observe that thing happening, but I'm in a whole other world and a whole
right,
untouchable
right.
reality.
And so you can think it has nothing to do with you, but it has everything to do with you.
Hmm.
Um, because again, that same system, that same set of tools can be used against you.
Right. Right. So this dialogue, like this, so for me, what I feel now in this day and age is just this s- awkward air,
Mhm.
unsaid things, unsaid conversations, unsaid anger,
Mhm.
and on the other side, complete avoidance. Not, and then now like pivoting, trying to go into complete, not erasure, but saying like it's time to just move on. It's time to click in with what is working now and don't visualize a better world because we're the best people that created
Right,
this world. So
right.
what is there left to imagine? And it's that accountability. Um it's that, so what I'm starting to recognize is that there is a healing that's starting to be generated in the communities of people of color, especially black women, kind of delving a whole lot deeper into
Mhm.
healing. And that's what is going to create the outward expression.
Mhm.
The silence
Mhm.
they were so dependent on is starting to break. That comfort that people were so used to providing is starting to be less, you know,
Mhm.
inclined to, for me to do that. You know what I mean? Because I'm healing within myself and tapping into my core identity outside of this system
Mhm.
in a scale that whatever reality we're living, what I'm conceiving within myself outside of it is far greater than that,
Yeah.
far more imaginative. And
I think the people who are the most marginalized in our society, and in a lot of cases that's Black women, are the best positioned to see what is needed. So we can see what people do when they are around people whose opinions they don't care about or whose bodies they don't care about. So it's okay to assault Black women, insult Black women. So we really get to see what the society is, like we really can name it, which also best positions us. We're in the best position to know what is needed because we've been forced to do our shadow work and to reconcile with things in society and see them as they are. But this is new for some people. And so when you hear a lot on TikTok, other social media places, like I believe Black women, there's a lot to that because we've had to think about how to stay alive and how to keep other people alive and do the workarounds to keep people safe. And that's a different level of understanding of what it means to be a part of this society.
definitely. And now I'm curious to know then, from the station that we're at, like for example, somebody like me finding this out and discovering this and pivoting to still pull in my definition of success in this lifetime and
Hmm.
in the United States. I know you have the decolonization of neurodivergence, and also I think it was a infographic
Hmm.
about business and how you. So, could you just expand a little bit on how a neurodivergent individual, person of color, can navigate the idea of success in this entrepreneurial, large
Okay,
scale
sure.
field?
So, and related to make that bridge between where we what we've talked about to that,
Mhm.
the fact of the matter is most jobs are not designed for us to be okay. Most jobs that exist, because the logic is about extraction, extraction, extraction to the point of exhausting us. Most jobs are not designed for us to go to work, do our work, go home peacefully, come back to work.
Mhm.
So most organizations are not set up to support neurodivergent people, in particular neurodivergent Black people.
Mhm.
So one of the things we have to think about, and I'm not encouraging anybody to quit their job to do anything, but we have to think about how activating these environments are to our systems, to our nervous systems, keeps us in constant, like I think the infographic you were referring to is when your business feels dangerous.
Yes. Yes.
But the workplace constantly activates us. There's this cloud of blame
Mhm.
hanging over everything we do because we know that implicitly or explicitly we are being blamed for things. We
Mhm.
get punished a lot. Our studies show we get a lot more punished more often, harsher. And so one of the things we have to think about is we have to think about freelancing, we have to think about entrepreneurship, we have to think about how to create spaces to support ourselves and spaces that we direct. And
Yes.
so one of the things that I do in the unique space that I occupy is I talk real nitty gritty with people who have ADHD about what it means to be in business. And so what I do is I peel back the layers that other coaches don't talk about. So they'll talk to you about your 10K in 30 days, which is fine, right? I'm not knocking that. But as a person with ADHD, you have to tell me why I'm doing things. You have to tell me what sense it makes. And if you can't do that, then I can't hear you. And so we have to think about, so for example, talk to some credible, reputable people about what it means to be in business. What do you
Yes.
need to do first? What do you need to do next? How do you get set up? Okay, how do I focus my attention long enough to have an operation? Like just going item by item to make sure you understand what being in business is all about. And even if you have ADHD, you can be successful. You can do your main operation and go off and do your play projects. Because a lot of us are very prolific and will never not be prolific. So rather than spending time trying to be validated, so for
Mhm.
example, I see a lot of people on TikTok and it's like I've always been criticized for having so many ideas. Fine, that's what people are going to do. They're going to criticize you. But nobody is telling Elon Musk he has too many ideas, right? Because he has the resources to just do any kind of bullshit he wants to do.
Mhm.
So who's to say that you have too many ideas? How about you have ideas? Here's the idea that I can make work right now, and we can take the rest of these and we can put these in a parking lot somewhere or in an archive somewhere, and we can keep thinking about it. We can keep, or we can put a little effort towards acting on them, or we could just totally forget about them because a lot of our ideas we totally forget about. But the thing is to start by not invalidating yourself, by not saying you're too much of this. So when you start talking in degrees or amounts, then you start to get into some um, kind of self-sabotage kind of thing where I'm too much of this, I'm not enough of this, too loud, too quiet, like all these
Mhm.
degrees of things. What it does is it keeps us kind of moving in a loop. And so one of the things that I tell people when I coach them is let's start in a neutral place. So people tell you, no, let's make this strength space. And I said, no, we're not even gonna worry about strength space. We're gonna say, this is where I am, this is how I function, this is what I do, this is what I need. There is where I want to be. That is what I want to do, and this is how I want to do it. What's the distance between these two places? So it's not that I'm so great at this and horrible at that. No, here's where I am. This is what I need. This is how I function, but I want to be over there. Let's talk about that.
Mhm. Like the understanding more of who you are,
Mhm.
this thing that is a part of you,
Right.
and that distancing or that too much the degrees thing, I completely completely understand. So there was a period of time, right, in my childhood where I really wasn't needing that validation, and I was asking those questions when I'm asked to do something of why, but
Mm-hmm.
then it made me really susceptible to punishment,
Oh,
truly.
yes.
Yeah, and that heavy on that because I would question not only that, but then it also triggered the unhealed trauma because I'm asking you now to do.
So let me say this. So, and there's nothing wrong with needing validation. There's nothing wrong with that. So, there's a TikToker that I follow. It's in Play We Trust, and they talk a lot about co-regulation. And so, people in the same household that are have certain nervous system needs,
Mm,
and how because you need this, it's activating something in me,
mhm,
or it's making me think about when people cry, this is what happens. So it makes me uncomfortable when you cry. So I just want you to shut up.
yes.
She doesn't say it like that, but I'm saying it like that.
Yeah.
And so it's like just having your basic needs met triggers something for somebody else in the household.
Mm,
And so that's really tough. And going back full circle to our conversation, intergenerational trauma, that's a really tough thing to know how to manage in a household. And so one of the things I try to do in my business is work with people to create businesses that don't unnecessarily activate them. And
yes.
so that's going back to the infographic you mentioned when a business feels dangerous. I give examples of fight, flight, freeze, feign, and flop. And just to give a name to some things that people are feeling. And so I had this woman reach out to me. She had downloaded the infographic, and she's told me that as she was building her business, she had that open on the screen the whole time
Mhm,
because it kept her thinking about, oh no, there really isn't a tiger chasing me in the woods.
mhm.
This I'm feeling this because of this.
Right. Right. That
Yeah.
connection, the connections that you get to make. And one thing that hit me is that I'm settling into that for myself, like
Mhm.
settling into the space of saying, okay, I'm starting to recognize this is the way that my mind works. This is
Mhm.
exactly as you mentioned, this is where I want to be. And
Mhm.
how do I do this in a way where I'm here with myself and I'm grounded in self and full in self, right?
Right.
In knowing who I am and my
Right.
modalities
Yeah.
of thought, and
Yeah,
it's
because when you get into this thing about strengths and deficits, that can actually become a distraction from what it is you need. And
mhm,
I think that's a question. This is always a good question to start with. What do I need in this moment?
mhm.
What do I need from this moment?
Wow. For such a long time, and I do come from a toxic household, and there was much of generational trauma and abuse. And I think in those spaces, I even forgot what my needs are. Like I had to like
Right.
come back to saying to myself, like even my needs and wants, as well as my wants,
Right.
because
Yeah.
that blinked out for a long time.
Yeah,
Uh,
sure. Yeah, because
don't
you have to survive.
literally,
Right.
literally,
Yeah,
yeah.
so it's about living through the moment. And that's totally understandable. And you did what you could with the resources that you had to do it. So it
Mhm,
totally, totally makes sense. And so what I encourage people to do, so coming out of leaving
mhm,
corporations, for example, and think about this in terms of families also, but leaving corporations, it's easy to think that you're going to build a new life for yourself in a business
mhm,
outside of a corporation, but there are so many ways that you unintentionally replicate those same dynamics. So it keeps you in that same kind of trauma drive,
mhm.
even as you are starting something that you totally manage and you totally control. And so we have to pay attention to that. And what I do is I really do think about things in terms of systems, and I point out to people, okay, when you do that, this is what you're setting yourself up for 2 years down the road. When you do that, this is denying you the opportunity to rest when you need rest. So, for example, creating a situation where somebody else could come in and do whatever needs to be done in your absence. You're setting that up from the very beginning and showing people how to do that.
That is that is amazing. Now that you peeled that layer and now you're in this station now. So now you have to you know get in all these amazing resources, and that's why I'm so um blown away by the conversations that you're creating around neurodivergence and around success and around our history. And it's really incredible. And um, it makes sense to me how this conversation has gone from what is neurodivergence into the healing of our generational
Hmm.
trauma. And then now within ourselves, finding our success in that journey. The most important thing that I
No, go ahead.
realize is that I'm beginning to bloom because
Hmm.
of community.
Hmm.
Because I'm finding, like, I'm venturing slowly, like, hey, that feels like an, you know what I mean, an energy of somebody that is talking about this conversation. I'm curious, so let me go venture and create there. That's a community that's talking about this. Let me go insert myself and sit there. And it's doing something not only for my inner child but my neurodivergence, opening up this world where I'm not feeling alone and I'm not feeling rushed.
Right.
Yeah, to be
That's
on the
right.
other side of normalcy or
Yeah, and
whatever.
that's the two tenets of the white supremacy culture is, or beliefs of white supremacy has to do with urgency and individualism. Like it
Those.
really pushes, those are two of the tenets, all the tenets work together. But to bring this back around to intergenerational and thinking about being entrepreneurs. So I was thinking about in this country, and I know you have a different a different history. In this country, but I'm sure there's some overlaps too. In this country, we a lot of black people, but not all, went from being part of chattel slavery, right? And so we're constantly being subjected to triggers and damage to our nervous systems, and then you move from that to the factories, well, chattel slavery, Jim Crow, sharecropping, tenant farming. Again, some freedoms, some room, but also being subjected to people's whims. Then you move from that into the factories where you have all this noise, these very busy environments with big machines and all these things that are activating us, and also being under the watchful eye of people who are supervising. Then you move from the factories to like office work, which is a different kind of surveillance. And so now that we've had an opportunity to see what all this bullshit is, we can see that these are not safe places for us.
Right.
And so this is what is sparking, encouraging some people to go out and start their own businesses. And so what we have to do is to be careful not to carry that forward. So, for example, one of the things that I'm paying attention to is how much labor I am doing on TikTok for free. And I'm paying attention to this because this is a type of enslavement where I do this free work for this platform that benefits from it. And if I'm not getting anything from it, then it doesn't matter how big of an influencer I am. So I don't want to carry that enslavement forward.
Hmm.
And so I really started to think about that a lot lately. And I also don't want to contribute to other people walking away from their jobs, walking away from situations that they feel like they're being watched all the time and monitored, to then imposing the same types of systems themselves inside their own businesses.
Right, because that's the conditioning that's really so deep within. Unhinging
Hmm.
this thing,
And then when
unhinging.
you get coaches who are like that and don't realize that they're like that,
Yeah,
then they tell you to do things that keep you chained to your business.
right. And that's why I think what you mentioned about knowing your personal identity, starting to venture into who you are. And
Hmm.
like, kind of for me, what it feels like, I know there are parts that feel very secure, like that's me. And
Hmm.
then there are other parts that when it comes in to my trajectory of awareness, I'm like, is that me? I gotta like, but that's the questioning and that's the settling, because when I affirm it for me,
Mhm.
then it makes it, as you said, it allows me to
Mhm.
navigate the world differently
Mhm.
and to show
Mhm.
up differently, and really um, to respond differently
Mhm.
to those watchful eyes, to
Right.
those little, not little, because the microaggressions and the larger play. It does allow me to sometimes settle. I'm not as My nervous system is not as jacked up
Yeah. So
anymore navigating those.
once you get in that place, and one of the things that's helped me is just getting really curious about things
Mm,
and being open to what the environment tells me and reveals to me. But once you're in that place, you will see how unserious a lot of people are. Like
mm,
what they're doing, their antics. Now, the antics might be dangerous, but how, like, are starting arguments with you about invalidating you, or taking this point of view of we just need to stop talking about this. Like they're just not even serious. They're not even emotionally or intellectually connected to the conversation. So you start to see that, and then you'll say, "Stop playing in my face, because I don't have
yes,
time for this." Right?
exactly.
Because you know that you're not having a real conversation with them.
Exactly. That is so, so valid, that you're not having a real conversation with them. And
No, it doesn't mean anything to them.
yeah. And the thing about it is, as you mentioned, and this is the thing, this is not about liking or disliking. If it was really that simple, we would have been over that a long time
Right.
ago. You
Right.
know? You like me, you don't like me, who cares? It's what the dislike, your hate, and the danger of it. That's that's I think for me the red flag of it all is.
It's having the power of systems to take somebody's life. So it's there's a TikToker named Mr. Chaz, and he said this so eloquently one time. He said it's not episodic, it's systemic. So it's not about things that happen between me and a white person. It is about the system that, and we get into it and we walk away. The system that comes to bear on me for having, if you're at work and you get into it, the system that comes to bear on me even after I think it's over. So it really is about the system. So, but here's the beauty of our conversation. So, one of my favorite ages to turn was 30. And I really liked entering into my 30s, and I love working with 30 something year olds, especially early, but late 30s, early 30s doesn't matter. But there is a there's a spark, there's a hope, there's a possibility that I see in 30-year-olds that is so magical. I think it is a very magical age, and all the questions that you are asking, I think it's so wonderful that you are asking them at this age, because I think that you can find some answers that you can live with and that you can build a life from. And so I imagine that many of your listeners are about the same age as you are. I would encourage people to allow this age to be magical for them and open up opportunities. One of the things, like when I entered into my 30s, my mind slowed down so much. And what I mean is, some things that used to worry me or concern me didn't as much when I was like, my mind was all over the place when I was in my 20s. And I'm saying that this is an opportunity to really step into your creative self and really being curious and being open to the possibilities, but also knowing that there's work to do, there are things, layers to peel back. But there's so many opportunities when you enter your 30 to step into your adulthood in a way that you probably couldn't even imagine.
Wow. I That same magic that is had in this conversation is what I'm going to carry with me, because I completely agree. And as our hours coming to a close, I am just so thankful for you and for you taking the time to do this and for venturing into such dialogue and conversations and building these resources. I hope y'all are curious like me because I'm gonna I got some work to do now. So thank you so much, Dr.
You're
Douglas. It's
welcome.
been
Thank
a
you for letting me
pleasure.
be here. This is an honor, and yeah, it's hard for me to tell a 30-something-year-old no. So when they have a good platform, so um, yeah, it's been great being here.
Thank you so much, Dr. Douglas. And thank you, everybody who's tuning in. I hope you check out those resources and come through for the next episode of It's Our Time podcast. Appreciate you all and take care.